This is Pamela Smythe from the University of Waterloo. I'm one of the hosts of Beyond the Bulletin, the podcast of internal communications at the university. We bring you news and views from the U-Waterloo community. Please spread the word that we're on SoundCloud.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And now the interview from episode 134 of Beyond the Bulletin, originally broadcast on July 29th, 2022. If you felt pain at the pump and sticker shock while shopping, it's with good reason. Inflation is at the highest rate we've seen in decades. Here to tell us the way recent events created what he's calling a perfect storm for inflation is Jean-Paul Lamb. He's a professor in the Department of Economics and was an assistant chief economist and principal researcher at the Bank of Canada. As he tells us, we'll have to weather this for many months to come. Jean-Paul, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here, Pamela.
How is inflation measured?
So inflation is measured on a monthly basis by Statistics Canada. And what StatsCan does is collect prices from establishments in Canada of goods and services. They do not measure the price of all goods and services because that would be impossible. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is a basket of goods and services that is representative of the household expenditure of Canadians. It is divided into 8 major components, things like food, shelter, transportation, clothing, etc. StatsCan go every month and survey this establishment and look at how prices have changed compared to the same period the previous year.
Well, Canada's inflation rate hit 8.1% in June. That's the most recent data we have to date. That's up from 7.7% in May, which then had been the highest in almost 4 decades. How would you characterize it?
Well, it's something we haven't seen in a very long time. I think Canadians have been accustomed to inflation rate close to 2%, and credit to the Bank of Canada for keeping in the inflation rate at 2%. It is a problem that the Bank of Canada and other central banks around the world, because inflation is not just in Canada, it is in other countries and everywhere else, that these central banks are trying to deal with this problem by bringing inflation down to their target of around 2% by raising interest rate. So it is a big shock for Canadians. It is something we haven't seen at the policy level for a very long time. And it is something that the Bank of Canada and other central banks are dealing with and making sure that we return to inflation rate that we've been accustomed to, which is around 2%.
What does 8.1% look like?
So if you go back to the definition of the Consumer Price Index being a basket of goods, I think the nice example would be to use someone going in a supermarket with a cart and filling that, let's say, with 10 goods today. And then that person would go the same day next year and would fill the cart with exactly the same 10 goods that person bought the previous year. So then we would compare how much prices has changed compared to the same day last year.
Oh, I see.
So that's what this 8.1% represents. It is the price change in the basket of goods compared to the same period, that is June 2021. So the 7.7% was the increase in prices from May 2022 compared to May 2021. So the reference that we always hear about inflation is a reference to the same period the previous year.
Does that mean that if last year I spent $100 on this basket of goods, I am now going to be spending $108.10 on that same basket of goods?
That's correct. That's exactly that.
What's behind it? What's going on?
We know that when demand exceeds supply, prices increase. So if you think of demand, what's happening, we've had COVID and all the stimulus from the Government of Canada and the programs that the Government of Canada started during COVID to sustain the economy. This has created unprecedented demand because we've had people with lots of cash, lots of savings. So the demand for goods in the first place and then services have started to increase, whether it's domestic demand or demand from our trading partners. And now you couple that very strong demand with supply shortages coming from directly from COVID and the economy closing down, shortages in labor where people were not either able to go to work or people were getting sick and not able to go to work. And also now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where this has put enormous pressure on supply of food and energy. So this is a perfect storm for inflation, where you have strong demand and supply shortages. And the recipe for that, that's a perfect recipe for inflation. So those are the main factors. COVID, as we know, the government responded very quickly and decisively to this enormous shock by providing Canadians with a lot of cash and help, SERB and wage subsidies, etc. All these programs were meant to support consumption and investment in the economy. And rightly, many governments around the world implemented those programs to make sure that that their economies would not collapse. And it was the right measure to do at the time. So what this did was it increased the spending and purchasing power of Canadians because they had lots of cash despite having a severe slowdown in the economy. With the economy being closed as well, we were not able to spend on services, things like travel, restaurants, etc. So we diverted a lot of this extra cash to the purchase of goods. And what happened at that time was a lot of factories were being shut down, a lot of workers were unable to go to work. So the supply of goods suffered tremendously during COVID. So you had this perfect storm of large increases in demand for goods, but at the same time, significant decline in the supply of goods, which resulted in the inflation that we are seeing now. The Bank of Canada implemented what we call inflation targeting, that is the target point of inflation, which was 2%. And they've done that since the mid-1990s. And if you look at the data and the record of inflation until pre-COVID, they've managed to keep inflation at around that target, 2%. So they've been very successful in their mandate. And Canadians, and not just the Bank of Canada, but many central banks have also managed to do a tremendous job on inflation. We thought inflation was high inflation, at least, and volatile inflation was something of the past, that we would never see the high and volatile inflation we witnessed in the 1970s and 1980s. I think many central bankers slept well at night, thinking that this dragon was slayed. And what we also saw was when we started to see inflation creeping up in 2021, many central banks thought it was temporary, it was going to go away very quickly. So they kept that sort of rhetoric and language for a long period of time. But I think in hindsight, we know that they've been wrong. Obviously, inflation has been not only persistent, but very volatile.
Why is the target 2%?
So they did a lot of studies on that in the late 1980s and beginning of 1990s when they were thinking of implementing inflation targeting. I think it comes from, first of all, a history of the 1970s and 1980s where inflation was very volatile and very high. And a lot of studies were done on the cost of inflation. So what they found was that as inflation gets above 2 to 3%, that cost of inflation becomes very high for consumers and firms. So basically what the central banks want behind that 2% is for people and Canadians not to think about inflation when we are making decisions about consumption or investment. Inflation should not be a factor when we're making those decisions. So 2% is when we don't think about inflation. And also it's low enough that the cost is something fairly trivial for most Canadians and firms. What they don't want is what's happening right now, that every time we make a purchase or every time a firm decides to make a decision about investing, they think about inflation. That's where inflation becomes a problem.
Who's hit hardest when inflation is so high?
So everyone is affected by inflation because we have to consume, firms have to pay wages or spend on raw materials. But we know that inflation does not affect everyone the same way. Inflation usually hits the lowest income group the hardest, and that's because they spend a higher proportion of their income on food, shelter, and transportation. And those are the three components right now that's growing at the fastest rate. The other thing to know is that inflation is, when we hear about 8.8% increase in prices, that's the average in Canada. For example, in PEI, inflation is over 10% right now. So there are regional disparities as well when it comes to increases in prices. Some provinces are hit much harder than others.
Presumably, some of those items in that basket only went up a little bit, and then some went up a lot. And so that's how you get this 8.1% average.
Yes. So gasoline, we know, is one of the culprit of explaining this rapid increase in prices. So, for example, the gasoline, the weight in that basket is around 3.5%. So it's significant compared to, let's say, fresh fruits, which is around 0.7%. So if you have a 10% increase in the price of gasoline and a 10% increase in the price of fresh fruits, obviously, because gasoline has a larger weight in the basket of goods, that will weigh on inflation much more. So we've seen a rapid increase over all the 8 components. In the June report of inflation, all the 8 components of inflation of that basket have increased by over 3% or more. So that's broad-based inflation that we are seeing.
And if workers get their annual pay increase to sort of stay in step with inflation, it's not going to keep up with 8.1%.
No, wages have not been increasing at the same rate as the rate of inflation that we've seen over the last few months. The latest data we have is that the average hourly wage has increased by only 5%. So you can do the math easily that wage earners are losing purchasing power quickly every month because prices are increasing at the rate of 8%, but you're only getting a 5.5% increase in wages. So at the end of the day, that's where inflation hurts, that your purchasing power is being eroded very, very quickly. And the higher and the more volatile inflation is, the worse it is for workers. If we do see wages catching up to inflation, and we might see that because workers will start demanding higher wages to protect their purchasing power, we will see inflation going even higher because higher wages will start feeding into higher inflation, and higher inflation then feeds into higher wages. This is what central banks, including the Bank of Canada, is trying to avoid desperately, to break that cycle, that vicious cycle that we saw in the 1970s that was at the heart of how prices got out of control.
As inflation goes down, do we really see prices going down?
That's a great question. I think people get mixed up with inflation and the price level. We can have, let's say, gasoline at 180 right now, and if gasoline remains at 180, then inflation rate would be 0. Prices tend to be sticky, especially downwards. And corporations, when they set their prices and they see that they're making a lot of profits, they may not bring prices down to the level where it was before. And also we get accustomed to ultimately to these higher prices. We adjust our expenditure, we change our habits. So we may see a situation where inflation goes back to 2%, but the higher prices that we've been accustomed to and that we've seen in the last few months remain at the level they are right now. So that's not good for consumers because we are at a much higher price level, even though now central banks will say that they've slayed inflation and that they brought down inflation at 2%.
I have read that 2021 was the most profitable year for American corporations since 1950, and Canadian corporate profit margins skyrocketed in 2021. So that raises the question of greedflation, where corporations raise prices saying it's inflation, but really they're pocketing more profit. Do you think that greedflation is a factor?
So you're absolutely right. Corporations have made not only record profits in 2021, but they've seen their profit margins go up significantly during that same period. Greedflation is a factor. I think it's a factor that's exacerbating inflation right now. It's not the cause of inflation. I think what these corporations are doing, they are responding to higher demand for their goods. People are flocking to their goods, so they are taking advantage of higher demand and also of higher costs and passing these higher costs to consumers. And the reason is because we've seen over the years concentration in a lot of sectors where large companies started to buy smaller companies or started to merge with smaller companies. And that resulted in a lack of competition. Because normally what would happen if you are producing the same good as me, if you raise your price and our goods are substitutes, for example, and I keep my prices the same, then consumers will flock to me and will abandon you, right? We're not seeing that. We're seeing consumers going to these corporations, these large corporations especially, and continuing to buy from them. And that's because of a lack of competition that came from these mergers and these large corporations buying rivals over time. And that's a concern for the economy going forward, because whether we have inflation or not, that's not going to disappear overnight.
How do we get out of this?
Well, I think the central banks around the world, including the Bank of Canada, has done what it should be doing, that is raising interest rate significantly to get inflation down. What these increases in interest rate do is they reduce consumption because it makes consumption more expensive, because it is more expensive to borrow, for example. It is more expensive to invest. So it decreases consumption and investment, and eventually decreases demand to bring demand back in line with supply. So that's the hope. We know it takes a long time for these increases in interest rate to work their way through the economy, because we don't change our consumption overnight. We don't change our investment plans overnight. That's the main way we will get out of it. The other ways, obviously, we need governments to be prudent in their spending. We don't want them to be reckless, because this will add to further inflation, if they spend too much. And also the third thing I will add, we need a lot of luck as well. And if you look at what the government of Canada has been doing, we've been running large deficits for a number of years. Even if you exclude the extraordinary time of COVID, where we had record amounts of deficit, the government of Canada has been running deficit over the years. And that kind of expenditure coming from government can add to overall demand. And we know that in times where demand exceeds supply, you don't want the government to add even more to that demand by spending recklessly or spending more. So they need to be fiscally restrained, fiscally disciplined. And that's basically what they've done in the latest budget. I think they've done the right thing by being fiscally prudent, by making sure that they don't add fuel to what's happening with inflation right now.
How long are things going to be this bad?
It might take a while for inflation to go back to what we've been used to, the 2%. But I think the good news is, because inflation is mostly driven by supply shortages right now, we will see these shortages eventually come to an end, with supply chains going back to normal, with economies hopefully around the world reopening and functioning normally. We should see these supply chains and supply issues abating. And that's when we will see inflation finally come down. I think the good news, the silver lining, is that there's nothing fundamentally broken with the economy right now. Because if you look at unemployment rate, it's at record low. If you look at consumption growth, investment, it's still very healthy. So once we get past this inflation, I think the economy will go back to its path of being very strong, with lots of job creation. And hopefully that will happen once in the next 12 to 16 months, once we get inflation under control.
12 to 16 months. What can we, the consumers, do to help things along?
by being very careful with their expenditure, by substituting for cheaper alternatives. It will be painful for a lot of consumers in the next 12 months, not just through higher prices, but also because of higher interest rate. They will pay more on their mortgages, on any borrowing that they're doing. That hopefully is transitory, I think. That's what economists are hoping, that by 2023, the end of 2023, 2024, we get inflation under control and we start seeing interest rate normalizing as well. In the meantime, I think it's going to be a period of transition, a little bit painful for a lot of consumers. Hopefully, my hope is that wages start to also adapt to the higher inflation rate so that we at least don't lose, workers don't lose too much purchasing power and have their wages adjust to the level of inflation we're seeing now.
How does the inflation connect to recession?
The idea behind raising interest rate is to decrease consumption and investment. And it is more an art than a science. And it is very, very uncertain how the economy reacts to these increases in interest rate. So the hope of a central bank is that they raise interest rate enough to rein in inflation, but at the same time, they don't slow the economy too much. But sometimes they may overdo it, that they raise interest rate a bit too much and they slow the economy too much, then creating a recession. And the bad news here is that central banks are notoriously bad for reining inflation and creating recession. They don't have a good record of producing what we call soft landing in the economy. In the 1970s, when we raised interest rate significantly to bring in inflation, that created two recessions. In the 1980s, the same thing. And the 1990s, exactly the same thing. Hopefully this time they have it right, but history doesn't bode well. Because of all the variables that go in the economy, it is extremely hard to predict how consumers and the actors and the agents in the economy would react to increases in interest rate.
What else do we need to know, Jean-Paul?
We've learned a lot from the 1970s and the 1980s, how inflation could be managed. Inflation is temporary. It's not going to be the same inflation we've seen in the past. It's going to be painful for the next 12, 16 months, but eventually it will go away. And as I've said, fundamentally, the economy is strong. It might change, mind you, but right now, the economy is fairly strong.
Well, thank goodness it's temporary. Thank you so much for this analysis, Jean-Paul. It was really a pleasure and very educational.
Thank you for the invitation, Pamela.
Thank you for listening to this interview from the Beyond the Bulletin podcast from the University of Waterloo. You'll find our archive of full episodes on the University of Waterloo website, and select interviews are on the university's YouTube channel. Just look for our playlist there. I hope you'll join Brandon Sweet and me for new episodes on Fridays, and please tell your Waterloo connections about us.